Hello, and welcome to the fifth installment of our monthly interview series, Conversations with Bill, a series dedicated to capturing Bill Gribben's incredible legacy at Bentley University. I'm Vanessa Weigel. I'm a graduate of the HFID program and a member of the Industry Advisory Board. Each month, a different advisory board member sits down with Bill to discuss his teaching career and his immense impact on the field of human factors and information design. In this fifth installment, I'll be asking Bill some questions about his favorite teaching stories. So,
Mhm.
Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for doing this and taking the time to do this.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I'm actually excited to hear some of your
Hmm.
stories. I think just to kick it off, I'm curious to hear if you have a favorite class or lecture topic that you've taught over the years, and if so, why is that? What makes it special?
Yeah, good question. And I think my most favorite topic, particularly in the last 10 years, has been around the issue of design ethics.
Mm,
And I think it's this moment in time in the world that we live in. Where technology touches every aspect of our lives, usually bringing, tremendous value and opportunities and joy and pleasure to our lives. But it's also had some pretty profound negative impacts on people, particularly younger people, but not just younger people, in their mental health. So, talking about the responsibilities that we have, being in a human-centered design program, for the last 40 years, I've taught about the principles of human-centered design, understanding human behavior and leveraging that behavior to bring value and good things to people's lives. And perhaps we're a little bit naive about that,
mm,
thinking like, oh, everybody's going to do the right thing. And I'll be honest with you, until about 12 years ago, never really address this directly. But again, came to the realization when you look at what's going on, particularly in social media, but not
yeah.
just social media. We see it in the gambling apps now and so many other things where these behaviors have been turned on people and to manipulate people and to control people and so on and so forth. So, there's always two sides of behavioral design. There is the good side, leveraging it to make products more usable, more accessible and more inclusive. But all of those things can just be flipped and used to manipulate and control people. So I think I say I enjoy this. I wish I didn't have to do this, perhaps. It would be nice if we lived in a world, but it's again, when you study human behavior, you don't really like to think about it because it's a little depressing, but there is a lot of bad actors out there. And I think it exists probably within all of us, and most of us control it and deal with it. But a lot of people embrace it and then use this to manipulate people to their ends.
Yeah, I remember, maybe on the more benign side, like you talking about, I think it was like Waze or Google Maps and how that has impacted like communities and neighborhoods where they suddenly have uh, oncoming traffic,
Mm.
and how that's disrupted communities to the more nefarious perhaps with some of the manipulations in social media. I'm kind of curious when you think about kind of like the coming years and this next decade, like what are you most concerned about with regard to design ethics?
Yeah. So, I think a couple of things that I'm terrified of is one is it's going to be supercharged by AI.
Mhm.
So when you look at the damage that's been done when it's just been people powered, and people have some pretty severe limitations when we unleash the power of AI and the data. So it's everything coming together. It literally is the perfect storm of everything that we've been talking about for the last 15 years. So even 15 years ago, I can remember in classes talking about, how, data was being collected about you individually. And I think I would often tell, a story about, working for a subsidiary of the Nielsen groups that collected supermarket data. When you swipe your card and they know everything you've bought on that particular trip. And I can remember the program manager there at Nielsen telling me at the time, the most benign piece of data about your life is worth something to somebody else.
Hmm.
And it's not that piece of data in isolation, but it gets aggregated. And this was more than 25 years ago. This was maybe 30 years ago. And it really got me thinking about this, is that this kind of data, and this was the very, very early days of then at that point of the web. And social media didn't exist at the time. So even that kind of data gathering wasn't collected. But that left a really profound impression on me, this notion of data gathering about individuals and how it's being leveraged and how it's being weaponized and sold on the marketplace. You're literally being offered up. And when you think about that and what has happened when it's just been, again, people powered, when you think about it, using that to enable AI,
Hmm.
I don't think we can even imagine the impact it could have on our lives and in everything, and not just in consumerism, but think about again, not to go deeply into about this. Think about politics, and how it can be manipulated. And I think we saw it just the change in the last 4 years, how messaging was very, very localized and individualized based on that data they have on individuals. So
Hmm.
we're going to see it touch every aspect of our lives. So I worry about that, and I worry about it, with bad actors, but we also have bad state actors as well, who've learned that this is more powerful than nuclear weapons, and how that is being used on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we're all aware of that. So I think these are the things that probably worry me. I think we can look at all the positive, and there certainly are many positive things that will come out of AI. But that is one that is very negative. So on a whole topic of the ethics side of it,
Yeah.
I worry about that.
So obviously, like fostering awareness of this with students in the program is important. What is your hope or your goal when a student, then alumni, is confronted with these scenarios when they're out and working in industry or wherever? What are you hoping that they then do, or what kind of action do you hope they take as
Yeah.
a result of the
And
class?
Yeah, and you hope, again, I think it's a simple response, and then I'll elaborate, but you hope they'll do the right thing. I think the fact that we're having this conversation now, and we're having this conversation, in HF 700, we have it on the first day of class, we have it on the last day of class, and we have it every class in between. We talk about these ethical implications versus it was, one presentation 15 years ago. And I think a lot of the faculty are doing this as well. They're having these kinds of discussions. So we hope the students will do the right thing, but that's a hard thing. And I literally, say this out loud in the class is it's one thing to sit here in the classroom and everybody's nodding their heads that this is the right thing. It's quite another thing when the job market is tight, you have a mortgage, you have family to take care of, and so on and so forth. It's really hard to make the ethical decision. And I've watched people over the years, where they leave they leave the program nodding their heads, and then they drink the Kool-Aid, and before you know it, they're justifying what they're doing.
Hmm.
And that's human nature. That's human nature, because you have to live with yourself. So if you're doing things that are not necessarily in excuse me, in people's best interest, you've got to create a narrative so that you can live with yourself. Because I know everybody that comes into the program, basically really good people. And so when you see really good people do questionable things, how do they live with themselves? And so you see that and you hear that from people as they justify what they're doing and what the company is doing. Um, it's hard on the individual level, and I think, and I point out many instances, but again, you see at Google where people have spoken up, the people who are supposed to be in charge of ethics and AI, and how they've been dismissed, again over this or that. It's very hard for an individual to do this, but when people rise up in mass, and we've seen this at Microsoft,
Hmm.
where people literally walked out of the building and said, "We're not going to participate in this surveillance technology." I mean, this goes back, more than 4 years ago. But they literally they saw how this was going to be used. And again, it was being wrapped up in unintended consequences, like, oh, we're only going to use it in good ways, but they also knew, it was also going to be used to sweep people up.
Yeah.
And that was going to be the unintended consequence, but you can anticipate it. And if you can anticipate it, it's not unintended. You got to deal with it. But when people rose up, they killed that project. Now, again, we see a number of success stories like that. And, again, they can't do the work without us. I mean, and this is it at the end of the day. I think we talk about this a lot in the program, and I'm blunt about it, particularly if it's a publicly traded company. They are in the business of making money. Just deal with that. Deal with that. And the things that they'll do to make money are sometimes questionable and sometimes not in the best interest of the consumer or the customer or the end user. So how do we deal with that? We're the person in between. And how do we deal with that? And how do we make decisions about that? I think it should influence your job selection, when you're out interviewing and looking at companies. I think when you decide whether you're going to stay with a company and grow within a company, what kind of decisions, ethical decisions are they making when they find themselves in these, difficult, situations?
Yeah. And I think like what's so great is like even when you leave the classroom, you leave with a network of people that you can have these
Yeah.
conversations with and reach out to and like build these communities within design and research. And so I think that's a really powerful thing in that you're graduating a lot of students who have this kind of like ethical design ethics foundation going out there in the world, and at least they can find their other people
Yeah,
and to be
no.
able to have these difficult conversations because it is hard in practice to navigate that. But I think more people are getting practice with confronting this and encountering this in their own roles.
Yeah, and not to, and again, I know we're going to go other places, but I also don't want to leave on a negative note. I can also tell you that, and I'm searching for hope these days everywhere I can find it. But I look out at the classroom and I see people interested in these topics, and I see in this generation, again, I always got to be careful here. I don't offend earlier generations of students, but I see in this generation they've lived through this. They've suffered from this.
Hmm.
So they have a very different attitude, versus 20 years ago where everybody wanted to work, at, Google or Facebook or Apple or this or that. They wanted to be with these big groups, Amazon, so on and so forth. I don't see that anymore. There may be some exceptions in that mix, so I'll be careful. But with a lot of those companies, they're looking at it going, I don't want to be part of that practice. So where that used to drive, I think, the UX, new UX professional 20 years ago, less so today, less so today. And I think that's interesting. And that gives me hope because ultimately, people created the mess and people are going to have to fix the mess. It's not going to happen in engineering schools. You still don't see the engineers are still charged with building things. And that's what's happening in AI is that they're building. It's not unlike, social media. And again, the people who are building it know it's dangerous. And they've come out and they've said it and they've signed letters and proclamations that, it needs to be regulated and all these things, and it's not happening. So they're well aware of it. It's just like in the early days, of social media is that, talk to any social media exec and they never let their kids on social media. So they were building it for our kids, but they wouldn't let their own kids on it. They knew the dangers, but they were letting the marketplace decide. And we know the marketplace can't do this. And we've just seen this over and over and over again. So it has to happen within our community. I think the fact that this generation has lived through it, they've seen the good, they've seen the bad, they want a different future. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, clearly an important topic in the classroom. Going beyond kind of favorite topics to teach, in all your years of teaching, I'm sure you've witnessed a lot unfold in the classroom. I'm curious, what's one of your favorite or most memorable teaching moments, Bill?
My favorite is always, I think maybe I'll describe two, but they're probably very closely related. Is my favorite moments, and it happens every semester. I won't say it happens every week, But you would think after, in at the graduate level, 25 plus years, you would think I've heard every question. You would think I've been challenged from every different angle. And it's every semester, and as I said, quite frequently, within the semester, that I'm waiting for that moment when somebody asks a question that never has been asked before.
Mm.
So when
Mhm.
you're thinking about, literally when I broadened it out into the certificate program that's, was, more than 35 years ago, is you would think with thousands of students, every question would have been asked. And I think to me that's the interesting thing about studying human behavior. There's always a new perspective. There's always a new way of thinking about it. You're never done learning. You're never done mastering this, and you'll never master it. So I think those moments when I'm asked a question that hasn't been asked before, that challenges my thinking, that sends me home to do the homework, not just the students going home to do the homework. I think those are my favorite moments. And and in a similar way is when somebody takes, and I think this is the great thing about our program, and I think it's the great thing about the students who are attracted to this program compared to some of the other programs out there that are very, kind of software enterprise application oriented, sophisticated system. We're really about the design of, and I'll steal Donald Norman's term, but the design of everything. It really is about the design of everything. We apply this deep understanding of people to every aspect of life and the designed experience, whether it be architectural design, fashion design, packaging design, whatever it happens to be. And I love the fact that, the students in the program, I think they're drawn to the program because of that openness. And I love how they just freely make these connections. Is that again, they're not narrow-minded, they're not closed-minded. They don't say like, oh, we're talking about mental models and how it applies to system design. They're talking about, again, this happens. I started this at the pandemic, but where I hang around after class and I said, okay, what I do is, I stay around for, 45 minutes at the end of class. And I said, okay, now we can talk about these behaviors now that we've talked about all the system stuff. How do they apply to life? How do they apply to your relationships with others? How does it apply to the things that we see going on in the world today? Things that, maybe we can't talk about, but also that deepens their learning. And you might remember, the more diverse connections you can make around any topic area, getting outside of the system world, it's
Mhm.
deepening their learning. It's really getting them to explore the application of all of that. And I think again, I love those moments. I love those moments when students make those connections and connections that I haven't thought about. Again, I know now that I haven't made every connection in the world. I would at one time I would like to have thought I had. But when students do that for me, I think it's great. I love the moments when, and you can see there's a theme here. I love it when students prove me wrong. Where I say like, I don't think that's the right way of going about this, but I tried to give them the freedom and latitude to do so. And I think a lot of times, and it's probably a statement about our educational system, where students are terrified doing that, and then they don't trust the faculty member when they say that. But I literally will come back and say, I give more credit when you prove me wrong. Because again, it means you took a risk, one, and there's a risk with it. You could fail with it, but when you pull it off, the reward is great. The reward is great, and this is why people always ask me, what's the right way about going about these product reviews? And I'll say, there isn't a right way. I've seen so many different ways, and if I were to give you just a small range, you'd replicate those rather than exploring all of the possibilities. And I would say the other thing that brings me great joy is, when a student comes into the program, probably 90% of the students that come into the program in a given year, I know they're good fits, they're typical fits, high probability of success. Very deliberately, as part of our recruiting process, we recruit people that don't fit the mold. Okay. For a lot of reasons. One is I think people deserve a chance. I think that gets factored in. I think secondly, the more diversity you bring into the program in terms of diversity of thought, like somebody coming in from theater, for example, or from the music industry, they bring a different perspective.
Hmm.
And it brings me great joy when you take a risk, and it's a risk for us as well, because this is a person that could come out and reflect potentially poorly on the program. But when they are extremely successful both in the program and afterwards in their career. And again, I think it's risk taking on their part coming into the program. It's risk taking on our part, accepting them into the program. But when it pays off and plays out the way we hope it does, it brings me great joy, and I know it brings the students great joy as well.
I'm curious if there's a particular question that's been asked of you or a new connection that's been made or some specific example of like when a student maybe challenged your thinking that comes to mind.
Wow. There's so many of them. I'm trying to think if there's one that would even one that's more recently. You're gonna stump me on this one here in terms of
We can come back to it if
yeah, let me give that thought, because again, coming up with one specifically, I'm looking for that exemplar, that one that's going to just kind of blow people away, and the ones that are coming to mind may seem interesting to me, but they seem somewhat mundane. But go ahead. Why don't we move ahead and we'll come back to that.
sure, sure. So obviously it's a rigorous program, but of course there are moments of levity in the classroom. So I'm curious if there's one of the, maybe more humorous or funnier moments that's unfolded in the classroom.
Oh, interesting. I'm again, I think we do have it's a very, like you said, you framed it beautifully, is that it's a very demanding program. But I think we do have fun. I think we do have fun. I think there are those moments where, where, again, somebody will make a connection outside of the domain area of system design and engineering psychology, and connect it to something much larger, that, again, like the stories I tell in the classroom, that connect it to their children. Those kinds of things I think are a lot of fun. I think they're fun. I think it's sometimes we're just too focused about things that are practical and have an immediate
Yeah.
value and
Mhm.
outcome. But I think education, and I think this is where education has gone bad, is that we're so focused on those outcomes and those near-term outcomes, that we're not looking for that broader, richer experience. And that can be fun, and it can be less serious. And as I said, I started those after class sessions, during the pandemic, just because everybody was so stressed out, is, just provide some more human contact. But we've maintained those now, several years afterwards. And I think a lot, and it's good, because again, 700 produces a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress. And I
Yeah.
think it's good to have that release valve where and again, you have to be careful about it as well, because there's always somebody in the class that's very stressed out because of performance, and that's always going to be the case. And so you're walking a fine line there between levity and again, the seriousness of students' performance. But I think it can be there. I mean, every once in a while, I'll even do something. I'd have to do it very carefully, again, for that same reason, when I'm evaluating, people's work, is that it shouldn't all just be negative, like, again, a lot of times, like, they're working on, executive functioning and metacognition right now. And, I'll connect the performance issue within that review to what
Hmm.
they're actually talking about. Is that, you need to better manage this, and this is what we're really talking about. You need to better manage your thinking as you're writing. And it's exactly what we're studying here. And I'll do that in kind of a light sort of way, but also learning comes out of that.
So you're getting meta on metacognition.
I know. Well, and I think I've been doing that more recently, I've always known this. Is that, the experience that you literally have in that class is really what you're studying.
Yeah.
where most people come in and they're novices and they struggle like a novice, where they're putting so much more effort in to build out those that schema and those mental models and so on and so forth, and connect things together into a coherent whole. And that's hard and it's frustrating and it's stressful. And but then, I remind them constantly, in the middle of that journey, and now we're towards the end of the journey, it's getting better, isn't it? What you've experienced is the building of expertise, is that, you have the framework in place now that it's allowing you to deal with this very, very difficult and challenging material at the end of the semester. But it's so much easier than it was in the beginning. So again, to keep pointing those kinds of things out is that what you're studying and what you're experiencing are one and the same.
Yeah. So we talked earlier about, the joy you get from when you're surprised by a student or they ask you a question that you didn't expect. And I'm curious if there's a specific memory of where you've seen a student have an aha moment in the classroom or seen like kind of a light switch flick,
Yep.
maybe in the context of 700.
Sure. No, and that happens every semester. And again, I've been much more open and transparent about this, I think, and this is where I think my teaching has matured over the years, hopefully for the better. But where I talk about this out loud in the classroom is, for some people, it's going to click in the first review or two. It's just gonna hit immediately. Sometimes it's because of the prep, what they studied as an undergrad or their work experience or whatever the case happens to be. Usually, again, most people struggle to a certain extent, but it's usually like in the second and third where you see like boom, where they go, there's a process, there's a way of thinking about this. Yes, every review is a different behavior, but I approach it in a similar way. So it's all behavioral mapping. So that's the umbrella, and all you're doing is plugging in a new behavior. And they learn that there's a process, there's a way of thinking about this. And again, it happens at different stages. And again, it's one of those things that as a teacher, and I'll just say teacher, that brings you again, probably the greatest joys when somebody has struggled. And I'm seeing it, now, and I see it every semester, where students have struggled maybe for the first two or three reviews and then go from, a C plus to an A.
Mhm.
And they make that leap. They make that leap. That's great, because I think everybody that comes into the program, has the potential. We wouldn't admit them if we didn't think they had the potential to succeed. But students will struggle in every class. Different students will struggle in different classes. But you hope for that moment where it clicks, and it's our job and it's our responsibility to kind of help them to get to that point, and support them along the way, and not let them quit. I get students every semester. Some I think, because of, the circumstances, it maybe is best to quit. I don't mean quit, but withdraw from the course and try, under better circumstances. But
Mm.
I think there were some students where I, encouraged them to persevere and provide that support. And again, when they do succeed, I think they feel a tremendous sense of accomplishment, and it's a real confidence booster to say, look, I didn't quit. I dealt with something really, really hard, and I figured it out, and I had support. But even when they get to that point, then what I try to do is I try to wean them off the support as well, which is always a tricky thing. Is, you give them the support. It's again what we do in our work is with performance support is you scaffold it. It's there when somebody's onboarding, then you slowly pull it down as they feel more accomplished. So we bring that same kind of scaffolding into the classroom, hopefully in our teaching.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll say from experience, there are a few things more satisfying than getting an A on a paper in your class, Bill. So attest to that. All right, last question for you.
Yep.
So in the course of the program, HFID students complete a number of projects, putting theory into practice. Can you share a story of a student project that particularly stood out to you over the years?
Ah, again, it's almost like it's one of those ones. There's so many, it's hard to nail it down. But I'm going to give you an answer this time, because otherwise this is not going to be at all interesting. I think, a couple of no, actually, it's probably a few years back now, where people look at, and it really ties a lot of things together. So, around issues of literacy, um, being inclusive, bringing in, both cognitive disability and neurodivergence.
Mm.
But again, where people have looked at products in the world where we tend, that a general population product. So it could be, you know, immigration forms
Yep.
and regulations.
Hmm.
And, not to get political, but I'm going to get political where people love to blame people and say, Why don't people just do it the right way?"
Yeah.
And I look at, and I've had students look at, so let's just look at the students because that was your question, who've looked at those those regulations and those immigration forms. These are students who are in a master's level class. I look at and say, I have a PhD in psychology and information processing. I can't make sense of them. So now you have a non-native speaker who could maybe or maybe not. Again, they may be very literate in their native language, but they're a non-native speaker. But excuse me, but they could also have a cognitive disability, in their native language, affecting their native language. So you have all of these factors that are involved, and then the stress of doing that and making the wrong choice, particularly, in the climate that we're in right now, that's very stressful.
Yeah.
And again, we study what stress does to people in their performance. And you know what? Sometimes they just give up. But we see that in something like that. I see examples like that. I see it in voting evaluations of people where people have come in and evaluated like propositions that are on the ballot.
Hmm.
Again, the most basic, human right in a democracy is to be able to vote. But probably tens of millions of people are not able to vote in an informed way because it is not designed to be inclusive and accessible.
Yeah.
Healthcare. Again, HIPAA regulations are supposed to be our most basic right as a patient in the US healthcare system are not accessible
Yeah.
to tens of millions of people. And I'll leave you with one other that a student did recently is at the very least, I will get students who will review like healthcare things, information, aftercare instructions and things like that. And we'll demonstrate where, they at least some attempts at inclusivity have been made, to dealing with literacy levels and people with lower literacy and so on and so forth. It's non-existent in the financial world. And so again, anything from looking at, Social Security. Again, we fault people all the time because they're not taking their Social Security properly. Try to read those regulations in those guidelines. Take a look at again where people don't have, where again, less educated people, I want to be very careful here, but less educated people used to have pensions and they didn't have to worry about investing. There's no such thing as pensions anymore. Everybody has to manage their own investing. Try to find anything in the financial service industry that is making their services more accessible to these populations. So I've seen and I love it. And I kind of this is a nice way of wrapping up because it's where we started about ethics. I love seeing students who are looking at this, that they want
Yeah.
to design and create a more accessible, more inclusive world through a deep understanding of behavior. And again, at these most basic, in these most basic areas in our society of voting and healthcare and finance and immigration, it's anything but accessible. And I've seen so many reviews that have been done in those areas, and it really is heartwarming to see that. And again, it gives you hope.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember even I did one of my foundations papers on tax forms and kind of like the financial impact and complexity of that. And then, that was I mean, I think I can see a connection between like thinking about accessibility and then subsequently working on self-driving cars and working on making transportation more accessible.
Yeah.
So there is like a through line really from like, so what we covered at Bentley and that foundation and like what it led me to actually pursue in my own career. So I think that definitely holds true
No,
and perfect way to come full circle on our conversation today. Um, well, thank you so much, Bill, for your time and for joining us for this fifth installment of this monthly interview series. Stay tuned for a new episode with Bill each month, coming up until June 2025, exploring a different aspect of Bill's career and his incredible legacy at Bentley. We post a new episode the last day of the month each month, and that goes to the LinkedIn Bentley HFID Alum and Student Network group page. Thank you so much again, Bill. Thank you to our listeners, and see you at the next one.
Thank you, Vanessa.